Good morning and welcome to the Watching Humans podcast. I'm Skylar Thomas, your host. I was driving back from the Bay Area to this hole that I currently live in. I'm about to escape. And man, it's a bad drive. I'll tell you about that later. So there's all this gray on the horizon. The sky is gray. It looks really bad. And it's low to the ground. So it's not that it was overcast outside or just a generally gray day. And I'm thinking smoke, because that's just life in California now, because we're always on fire. And I get closer and I'm coming up on Dixon and then Davis. And so what it turns out, it was just farmers driving across their fields that are lifeless, and all the soil is flying up into the air. In some cases, it was an actual tractor turning the soil, which of course helps send it into the air. And in other cases, it was just a pickup truck driving across, and that's enough to send it all flying up into the air. And there's enough of this dust going up into the sky that the horizon was gray. That's not healthy soil. If there were plants in the ground, if there was a root system, if there was any natural moisture, that's just... soil doesn't want to go into the air until you have a real serious storm. But that's not the case anymore. So guess what we're talking about today? Kind of continuing with the stewards of the land thing, is the concept of food. The ultimate excuse, the ultimate defense for any other flaw that you might find in ranching practices is the concept that, well, you're being fed. You want food, right? Gotta eat, right? Ah, man. How many people have taken a deep look at the food system? I'm pausing intentionally because I want you to answer that yourself. Have you taken a look at our food system? Not just the fact that it's legal to sell you poison in the stores and get the stamp of approval from the FDA. I'm talking about the quantity. I'm talking about the efficiency. I'm talking about the mass production and how much of it ever goes into someone's mouth. Because the percentage is really low. It's really low. My point being, we are using almost 50% of the United States for grazing or crops to feed cattle. And then there's this itty tiny percentage being used for fruit and vegetables that humans consume. Look out the window when you drive through California and count how many times you see hay bales. Hay being gathered, hay being loaded, or just hay sitting there waiting for something to be done with it. Unless human beings have started eating hay and there is a hay aisle taking over marketplaces, you're not seeing food for human beings. Yes, it goes into a cow or some other livestock, and somewhere way down the line, maybe you will eat the flesh of that animal. Once, for years and years and years, it has consumed all of this hay and all the water. But it's not even just the land use, the insane land use for cattle and other livestock. It's the fact of how much never gets consumed. And all you hear about is, gotta feed people. We gotta feed these growing populations of people. If we were concerned about feeding hungry people, our food system wouldn't be the way it is, because the hungry stay hungry and the gluttonous are gluttonous, and most food ends up in a trash can. Well, that's expensive, and therefore you are going to have to fit the bill for that with your tax dollars. Waste is expensive, but you can't stop producing food. That's true. You can't stop producing food unless each and every one of us develops skills to find our own food, which really is probably where we should be going. God knows we could use the exercise that would come with foraging, but we're not going to do that. So Yes, food production has to continue, but food production continuing the way we're doing it now just means more land used, more water used, and more waste. I keep asking myself whether or not I should quote numbers, because does it matter? Like, some of these numbers are so staggering that it's going to go over your head. You know, when millions of tons of something was wasted or recalled, how do you even process what that looks like? And then you can just go into denial. You know, if your bottom line is that you're going to defend the industry, you'll just say that it was a bogus number and that you want to see some other sources. And let's be honest, it doesn't matter how many different sources agree with that number. If you don't want to believe it, you aren't going to believe it. So look at your personal life. Look at your personal life. Spend 2 weeks putting all the food that never makes it into your stomach. Don't put it in the regular garbage. Don't put it in, well, you shouldn't be putting it in recycling. Don't even put it in the compost if you are a composter. For just 2 weeks, put aside everything that never actually makes it into your stomach but did make it into your home, whether it's the refrigerator or the kitchen counter or the cabinet, because I am a pretty efficient person and I really try not to waste. Obviously, I wouldn't have this sort of a podcast if I was a waster, but even I end up with a surprising amount of waste. I'm guessing that most Americans are incredibly wasteful, but you know what? Do the 2 week experiment. Even trying to be better than you normally are just to prove me wrong. Do it for 2 weeks. I bet you'll be shocked. But it starts way before that. Way before the personal example and what happens in your own home. Because a lot of grocery stores won't even accept food that doesn't look perfect because people have learned to reject food that isn't exactly the shape that they are accustomed to it being shaped as. So that gets rejected and thrown out. There's all the food that remains out in the field. There's all the food that ends up on the side of the road. There's all the food that falls out of the trucks. Now, for anyone who wants to deny any of that, remind me to post my footage of Dixon, the quote Greenbelt, which is a ridiculous title. It's land that was raped maybe a long time ago. Before agriculture, it was green. Now the only thing green there are monocultured products that suck all the water out of California, as is the case from top to bottom in California. It's amazing that anything's alive here at all, considering that California is agriculture from top to bottom. Of course, when I say I'm surprised anything's alive, I'm talking about wildlife, anything that is supposed to be here naturally. I'm not talking about crops. Yes, crops are alive, but for every crop that's alive, natural creatures are dead. My girlfriend just arrived back from Southern California as I was finishing recording this podcast, and she told me about these signs along the farms that were calling this drought the Pelosi drought, and that she was dumb for allowing water to reach the ocean or something like that. This is reminiscent of 2009 when busloads of Central Valley farmers came to San Francisco to demonstrate in front of Pelosi's office because of water restrictions, environmental water restrictions. Again, can we talk about this label, Stewards of the Land? Because these farmers were angry that we were trying to save the Chinook salmon because we were Pelosi conservationists were allowing the river to have enough water for salmon to survive, and farmers were mad about it. No. That's all our water. That's all for us to make profit. That's all for us to make a living. Fuck the land. Fuck the wildlife. Fuck nature. And don't forget to keep calling us stewards of the land. I'm curious about my audience. Like, how many people don't actually know that agriculture is the reason that massive rivers that once flowed no longer flow? How many people are unaware of how agriculture destroyed fertile valleys? How many people are unaware that farmers got water rights, which meant that they could waste the shit out of water and have? How many people are unaware that in a drought-stricken state, we choose to grow commodity crops that are highly in demand of water instead of maybe turning to Mother Nature and saying, hey, what were you able to grow here? What drought-resistant plants actually provided fruits and nuts and other types of sustenance to the creatures that were living here, including human beings, the Native Americans that lived here? No. Screw all that. We're going to kill all of that, and we're going to grow commodities that require insane amounts of water. We're going to do it inefficiently. Everything else is going to die. And when things get hard, we're going to point the finger. Agriculture is the worst thing that ever happened to California. That's a big statement and worthy of its own separate podcast. But can I just say really quick, can we just have a reality check that all these farmers putting up their signs and complaining, they're not upset because hungry mouths aren't going to be fed because of the drought? Can we just be honest about that? They're upset about profits and profit margins. And usually there's enough government programs based on taxpayer dollars that bail them out anyway. But what they're certainly not upset about is that the food they're producing isn't going to reach hungry mouths. Not to let the consumers off the hook. It's not just the farmers. When you guys get mad during a drought, it's because you see price changes. It's not because you also are upset that fewer people are going to get fed somewhere. The same number of people continue to not get fed. It's just a matter of whether or not you have to spend more money or have to be inconvenienced by not having your favorite thing this week. Anyway, back to Dixon, back to Northern California. And, this is all cattle. It's so much cattle, but I'm going to focus on non-cattle for a change. I stopped and filmed the agriculture going on there. One really good example was the tomato harvest, and the number of tomatoes just everywhere was insane. And when I mean everywhere, I mean still laying out in the field. I mean laying in the ditches. I mean falling off the back of the truck as I followed the truck. Now that I review my footage, it looks like half of the plants were getting run over by the truck that was harvesting the other half of the plants, just like smashing them and running them over. Well, as long as you get a bunch of them into the truck, that's what matters. Look, it cost so much in terms of resources to produce that many tomatoes, just so this could be massively distributed to a bunch of different stores, and maybe some of it made to the shelves, the ones that actually made it from the field into the store. And then in the store, there's all the ones that don't make it out to be displayed for the people in time. And then, of course, if the people don't buy the supply that's on the floor in time, then all of that has to be thrown out. And then there's the people that bought the food, took it home, and never got around to eating it before it got overly ripe or rotten or whatever the case may be. What about the recalls? What about all the infected food? What about all the salmonella? What about when you hear about X company had to recall all of their spinach? X company had to recall all of their hamburger. Well, the resources required to grow that stuff were already spent. So don't tell me that wasn't waste. How about when you hear about trucks overturning on the highway filled with 800 chickens that were just smashed together in an insanely cruel manner of transportation, and the truck turns over and catches on fire, and all these chickens are smashed or burned to death. And, well, those chickens, even if you don't want to think about the horror of their lives, they required a lot of resources to grow and turn into the flesh that you were going to consume. Have you calculated that? How about the floods? How about the floods? Maybe you don't hear about these things if you aren't conscious about our food system or about what you eat or where it comes from. You know, if you're not vegan, you probably don't think about your food sources. So you probably try not to think about the floods and when, thousands and thousands and thousands of heads of livestock drown because they just get left behind in a flash flood, or when there's a fire and they're left behind in pens and they're stuck behind fences, or they're inside of barns and they don't even have a fighting chance. They're not even allowed to flee and they burn alive. How many of the corpses of these animals are collected and then sent off to hungry people? I'm guessing that there are rules that prevent that, even if someone was willing to do it. But look, in this food industry, what's the priority? It's the profit margin. It's the money. It's the bottom line. If you spend money on a product that you lost because it never made it to the store, you're not going to spend more money trying to send it to poor people that are actually hungry. That is not what our food industry is about. I'm sorry. Let's get back to the 50% thing, because that's an actual goal. We're trying hard to leave 50% of the planet. Wow, how generous. One species is considering leaving 50% of the planet for all other species. Except that that's not even true. We're just considering not using the other 50% for certain things. But in one way or another, we're pretty much going to use it all. But imagine the millions of species that exist on this planet, and that combined, they don't use what one species uses to eat. Imagine that there was another species somewhat similar to the human being. Imagine we actually had to compete with another species that was sort of like us. Well, that's 100% of the planet. And we're already screwed, and we're already at war with each other. The two species would already be at war with each other because of our insanely inefficient food system. I mean, before humans modernized and developed all of these ways to efficiently wipe out competition, there were a lot of animals on this planet. Way more than there are now. So explain to me how those animals were able to survive. How are they able to eat? Okay? And obviously, the earth is capable of producing enough for consumption. It's the way that we are doing it that doesn't work. And then people act like, well, we're human beings. We don't eat what they eat. You act as if our food came from another planet. In the end, it's the same food. It's stuff that grows out of the ground. It requires soil, it requires water, and it requires sunlight. Even if we're talking about consuming the flesh of the animals at some point, that also required soil and water and sun, because those animals ultimately have to eat the producers, the plants of the planet. Otherwise, they would never grow big enough for you to be able to slaughter them and sell them in the store and waste most of the flesh anyway. We are all eating the same thing. We are all recycling energy here. We have just decided to do it in a really, really dumb way. A really destructive, stupid way. Why? For convenience. For convenience. I mean, the fact that I can go to 4 or 5 different grocery stores within 4 or 5 city blocks, and every single one of them has food laid out for me to hand pick from, there's no way in hell all that is going to get purchased by people before it goes bad. But it's so important for us to have a nice display. Look at all this flesh. Look at this seafood. Look at these animals that we took from the ocean that are in Kansas on a shelf, in case you happen to decide that you want to have shrimp at your football party. How much of that never made it there? It doesn't have to be a seafood example. It could be anything. I mean, flesh rots so fast. That's got to be on a higher scale than me using the examples of tomatoes. How about, because fall is coming, today I saw all over the store pumpkins, just tubs and tubs and tubs of pumpkins. Let me tell you something. If hunger was an issue, maybe we wouldn't be decorating our homes with food. Food! Did you forget that pumpkins are edible? Pumpkin pie? Hello? Pumpkin seeds? I guarantee you that wildlife would love to have those pumpkins that are just sitting there at your house because it's tradition to put these things up. And don't get me wrong, I love Halloween, I love fall, and I love pumpkins, but how many resources were required for there must have been 500 pumpkins in these boxes at the store. One store. They were just piled on top of each other in case people decide that they're ready to start decorating. How much of that's going to get wasted? And, oh God, what percentage do you think is fair for me to say of those pumpkins that won't get consumed? Some people will try to make pumpkin seeds or whatever, or do something not incredibly wasteful with the pumpkin. But most people, if they make a jack-o'-lantern, are just going to hollow it and throw that out. And people that don't make a jack-o'-lantern, well, the pumpkin just sits there until it finally collapses upon itself. That's food. That's food. That's food. And that's how we think about food. The tradition, the decoration is more important than solving hunger. Now, I get the importance of tradition. I'm just saying, can we not pretend that we all give a shit about feeding the world when we're decorating our houses with food? It's not your number one priority. Otherwise, you would send that pumpkin to someone who will turn it into food instead of decorating your front porch with it. Wait, I have to check that. Let me take that back. I forgot that now they are bleaching or some sort of process with these pumpkins that makes them last longer. In fact, they've issued warnings. Don't put your pumpkins out in the wild after Halloween because it will poison the wildlife. So, yeah, that's what we do with food. We grow it so that you can decorate with it, and we put a layer of poison on it. But yeah, we're worried about feeding the planet. There are rivers of milk, of dairy, rivers. That's how much of the dairy industry is dumped every year. And yet, my God, the ad campaigns about how important it is for your local dairy farmer to produce this important food item. The amount that we dump is bizarre. You would have to see it to believe it. Like actual rivers of it. And we just keep making more. Maybe if we gave a shit about hunger, we would stop producing something that we dump. Okay, that's enough for this episode. Thanks for tuning in. What is my point? I understand that things aren't perfect. I understand that the food production system isn't perfect. I understand that perfection is hard to achieve. I don't think we're pursuing perfection. I think that there's a system in place that bails out the producer. I think there's a system in place that bails out the distributor. I think there's a system in place that says the most important thing is that people keep buying, or at least are still happy going to the grocery store. We aren't worried about hunger. Just stop the bullshit about being concerned about hunger. And if you stop that bullshit, maybe you can stop the bullshit of pretending that destroying the planet, which is what ranchers and farmers do, is worth it because we have to eat. I almost forgot. Some of you are going to be saying, well, that's why it's important to support local and produce locally. When are you going to draw the line about what's local and what's not? Because I guarantee you, all those farms through Dixon and all those farms through the Central Valley and along Highway 5, every single one of them is advertising family, organic, sustainable, local. So when exactly does it stop being any of those things that I just said? And here's where we'll circle back to point raise. You are quick to defend by using these buzzwords that you've been taught to use, like an obedient robot. Have any of you actually dug into where these people that you defend distribute to? Seriously, have you? Have you bothered to find out how far they export their products to before you declared local? Do you know? I do, and it sure as hell ain't local. Maybe a little bit of it makes it local, but a lot of it goes way beyond what local is. Well, I don't know. I guess you get to define local however it fits you and your excuse making. I've walked through the stores in Point Reyes Station, in Inverness Station, or Inverness Park. Look, there's a teeny tiny bit of animal product in there. Teeny tiny bit. The vast majority of these stores is still fruits and vegetables and nuts and miscellaneous things. It just isn't true. As horrifying as the meat section is, to me, not even because I'm aware of how that meat ended up there, but because it's sitting out in the open, well, it's under glass, displayed for you, and you know that all of that flesh on display is going to get thrown out because it's been on display all goddamn day in the open air. That's still a small section of the store, relatively. And I think in Inverness Park, I think the store there had zero, next to zero. Stop pretending that it's important. Stop pretending that it's important for your local survival, for those ranchers and farmers to keep wasting land for livestock. It's not even in your stores. Not only is it wasteful and inefficient and unsustainable, it's not even in your store. All right. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the next podcast.